The late afternoon sun filtered through the holes in the rusted tin roof, casting narrow rays onto the dry, cracked ground where a frail body lay silently among the ruins. Max, a Belgian Malinois war dog who once stood proud on the battlefield, was now only a shadow of his former self. Rusted chains dug deep into his neck, caked with dust and dried blood, the remnants of countless merciless days in captivity. His once glossy, dark golden coat, which used to shimmer under the Middle Eastern sun, now clung to him in dirty clumps, shedding in patches that revealed parched, scarred, and wounded skin. Gone was the scent of hot sand. Gone was the wind that once howled across the desert. Gone was the familiar voice that used to call his name through the deafening sounds of gunfire and smoke. What remained was a dead, suffocating silence, occasionally broken by the buzzing of flies near his clouded eyes. Every breath Max took was a labored effort, his chest heaving as if the heroic heart inside him was slowly being eroded by time and by forgetting. But there was one thing that hunger, pain, and betrayal could never take from Max. His memory. The memory of his handler, Lauren Carter. He still saw her in half-lucid dreams, in her dusty uniform, face damp with sweat, but eyes always steady and full of resolve. Lauren was his entire world. The voice in the night, the calming touch amidst chaos, the one who once held him close when both barely survived an ambush. Together they had been unstoppable. And then she vanished, without a word, without a trace. Since that day, Max had lain here, counting the days through the scurry of rats and the whisper of wind slipping through the gaps in the roof. Until today. A sound broke through the silence he had grown numb to. Footsteps? Slow, heavy, but real. Not the cold steps of indifferent workers, not the hurried shuffle of passers-by. These steps, Max had heard them 100 times before, through darkness, through explosions, through pain. His heart reacted before his body could. His head was too weak to lift, but his ears twitched. His eyes opened, still dull, but for the first time in months, a flicker of light returned, like an ember in a bed of cold ashes. The footsteps stopped right outside the rusted door. Max held his breath. A faint tremble passed through his body. He knew, he felt who was on the other side. His heart raced, not from fear, but from something long forgotten. Hope. The door creaked open slowly, its hinges screaming in protest. But Max didn't flinch. The last light of day flooded in, hitting his weary eyes. And then, through the blinding brightness, a figure emerged, not clear, not sharp. But Max knew. Every cell in his broken body recognized her. Lauren. A cry, silent but raw, rose from within him, not made of sound, but of heartbeat, of gaze, of instinct, the instinct of a warrior who had never forgotten the comrade who once stood by his side in life and death. In that moment, Max's gaze was no longer that of a dying creature. It was the gaze of a hero, betrayed, forgotten, wounded, but never stripped of his faith in love, in memory, and in the one who had once called his name in the heart of fire. And when Max's eyes met the familiar figure in the doorframe, glowing in the dusk, his body, once paralyzed by pain and hunger, began to tremble as if every nerve had awakened. In that instant, memories buried deep under layers of time and exhaustion surged back like a crashing wave, washing away fatigue and sorrow. Max was no longer in that damp, dark corner. In his mind, he was back in Afghanistan, among golden dunes burning under the sun, the roar of engines, the crackle of radios, and urgent orders echoing in the air. He remembered the first day at camp like it was yesterday. A young recruit, ears perked, eyes bright, heart eager. Hours of grueling training under a brutal sun didn't slow him down. He wasn't made for cages. He was made to serve, to protect. And then she came, Lauren Carter, a young soldier with sorrow in her eyes, but a steadiness in her stance. Unlike the others who barked commands, she knelt beside him, gently patted his back, and called his name with a soft voice that still carried the weight of command. From that moment, Max stopped feeling lost. He chose her. And from then on, they were a unit, bonded not by words, but by understanding. The front lines etched memories deep into his flesh. Max remembered sniffing out buried mines just seconds before convoys passed, chasing down bombers through sand-choked gates, enduring nights so still and eerie that only Lauren's breath kept him grounded. Once, in a sudden ambush, Lauren was badly injured, collapsing amidst chaos. Without hesitation, Max charged through gunfire, grabbed her vest strap in his jaws, and dragged her to cover, even as a bullet tore into his side and painted the sand red. They survived, but the scars never truly healed. And always looming behind these memories was Victor Shaw, a high-ranking officer, polished and disciplined, with eyes as cold as steel. Max would never forget that gaze. It wasn't for a living being. It was for a tool, ready to be sacrificed. Every time Shaw appeared, the air grew heavy, not just from his cigarette smoke, but from his heartless orders, treating people and dogs like pieces on a war map. After one mission where Max was injured but kept working, Lauren stood in the briefing room, trembling with fury, and said through clenched teeth, "He's not a machine, he's my teammate." Shaw simply scoffed, exhaling smoke through his teeth. "It's a tool. If you die, nobody cares. If it dies in your place, I've saved someone more useful." After that, Lauren was sent back to base due to her injury, and Max, without warning, was transferred out. Torn from his only companion, he panicked, screaming in his transport crate as if begging for answers. None came. The days that followed were a long, dark journey. From one facility to another, no one cared who he was, what he had done, or how he had survived. At every stop, he was met only with unfamiliar faces, mechanical orders, and endless nights haunted by dreams of a voice that never replied. That's why, when those footsteps returned to his world, when that familiar scent broke through the numbness, when his fading eyes saw the silhouette of the person who once meant everything, everything inside Max stirred. It wasn't just a flashback. It was his soul, the sacred memory of a dog who didn't just obey, but knew how to love, to sacrifice, and to stand as a true comrade. Max was never a tool. He was a warrior. And now, after all these forgotten years, the warrior had found his teammate again. And in his tired, fading eyes, for the first time in so long, life returned. Not loud, not sudden, but deep and enduring. But in that very moment, when Max's eyes lit up, recognizing Lauren at the door, another surge rose from deep within his mind, a cold, haunting tide of memories, days that dragged on endlessly, where time wasn't measured in hours but in hunger pangs, in wounds that refused to heal, in each crashing wave of hope that was crushed and left him emptier than before. These were not days of battle. There were no bombs, no commands, no Lauren, only darkness, chains, growls, and a silence colder than desert stone at midnight. After Lauren was pulled from the unit due to injury, Max was torn from her side without warning. There was no final glance, no farewell, no promise exchanged. He was loaded into a transport truck, locked in a steel cage alongside 3 other dogs, all former warriors, all survivors of places too brutal for most to imagine. Yet, during that long journey, no one spoke to Max. No one looked him in the eye. When the truck finally stopped at a remote training facility on the outskirts of nowhere, all that remained were heavy gates, harsh commands, and the iron scent of blood mixed with cheap disinfectant. It wasn't a home. It wasn't a place for recovery. It was a training camp run by Victor Shaw, the same officer, now stripped of his title, chasing profit over honor. He had built a network under the polished label of working dog retraining. But in truth, it was a machine built to drain the last drop of strength from loyal lives left behind by war. Shaw hadn't changed, still wore that smug, frozen smile, still stared at living beings like they were inventory, replaceable, discardable, dispensable. Under him worked a crew of coarse trainers, men without compassion, who didn't care what the word warrior had once meant to the dogs they broke. Max was locked in a cage so small he couldn't stretch his legs. The concrete floor was a bit like ice at night, and burned like fire by day. On the first day, he was forced through physical drills, even though his old wounds still oozed beneath the matted fur. Every failed command was punished by a painful jolt from the collar strapped to his neck. There were no soft words, no familiar faces, only shouts, snarls, and the clang of metal locks closing behind him after meager meals that stank of mold and despair. But what hurt Max most wasn't the hunger. It wasn't the pain. It was the loneliness, a raw, gnawing isolation that stretched across hours and days like a wound that wouldn't close. He had fought for a world that now pretended he didn't exist. No one had to say it aloud. Max understood. To Shaw, he and the others weren't heroes anymore. They were assets to be wrung dry, shells trained to perform, just enough to earn cash from private security firms or mercenary units looking for cheap soldiers. Once too weak to serve, they would be retired, one way or another. At night, in his pitch-black cage, Max would open his eyes and stare into the darkness as if searching for a shape he could no longer name. Some nights he barely breathed, lying still as death, ears perked, listening for a sound etched deep into his bones. The firm cadence of Lauren's boots, the click of a safety being flipped, her voice calling his name with the sharp, familiar command in German he had heard 1,000 times in the chaos of war. Max never believed she had abandoned him. He didn't understand why she hadn't come, but he believed she was still out there, trying to return. And that fragile hope, flickering but unyielding like a candle in the wind, was what kept him alive. He ate what he could, even if it was cold slop mixed with grain and grit. He forced himself to stand during training, not out of instinct, but out of defiance, to prove he was still useful. But the truth was, Max rose not because he had to survive, but because the memory of Lauren burned too brightly to fade. Her rare smile in the middle of a battlefield, her hand resting gently on his shoulder after every mission, her labored breath as he dragged her from a minefield. The way she looked at him, not like a tool, but like a partner. Max had waited in the dark, day by day, month by month. He didn't know how old he'd grown. He didn't know how much time had passed, only that if a voice ever called again, if a hand ever touched his head like before, he would know it instantly. And now, when his legs could barely stand, when his chest tightened with every breath, that sound, the one he thought he'd lost forever, returned. Footsteps. The door creaks open. Light rushed in. And Max knew this weight, this desperate, aching weight, had finally been answered. As the blinding light spilled into the room with each creak of the rusted door, Max blinked rapidly, as if trying to make sure his aged eyes weren't playing tricks on him, that the figure standing in the doorway, silent, trembling, uncertain, was truly Lauren, the comrade he had waited for through years of abandonment and silence, the one he had believed would never leave his side, yet who vanished like a shattered dream swallowed by a merciless reality. A familiar scent rode in on the wind, mingling with the dust rising from the dry earth. The scent of a uniform, of sweat, of pain, of memory. It struck Max's heart like a drum, rousing his frail body with something far deeper than instinct, something sacred. Lauren said nothing at first. She just stood there, clutching the strap of her bag, eyes wide with disbelief, unable to fully accept that the worn-down creature before her was Max, the courageous war dog who had fought beside her through fire, who had dragged her to safety, who had growled in death's face to shield her without hesitation. She saw the once golden fur now reduced to blood-matted patches of dull gray. She saw his trembling legs, too weak to stand. She saw eyes clouded by illness and trauma, and yet, within them still glimmered a look she could never mistake. The look of Max, her old friend, the soul she feared she had lost forever. Max didn't run to her. He didn't bark with joy like the dogs in those reunion videos people love to watch online. He couldn't. He no longer had the strength to rise, and more than that, he no longer had the certainty to believe this moment was real. He simply lay there, turning his head, ears flicking faintly, eyes fixed on Lauren, as if trying to find something in her face, some proof that this wasn't a dream, that this wasn't another cruel mirage, that this was her, was Lauren, the one he had imagined calling his name in so many sleepless nights. Lauren took a step forward, then another. She knelt onto the gravel and weeds, voice trembling too much to speak, until at last, barely above a whisper, she said, "Max." Still, Max didn't move. Only his eyes blinked slowly. No bark, no growl, no wagging tail. None of the usual signs of a dog reunited with his person. He had been hurt too deeply. He had learned to doubt his feelings. He had wagged his tail before, only to be met with electric shocks, kicks, and merciless coldness. It was as if he needed a sign, a secret code, something only Lauren would know, something that proved she wasn't just another illusion. And then, as Lauren's heart shattered from the pain in his face, so full of doubt, of hurt, she whispered, "Sitz." A single word. German. The command she had spoken to him thousands of times on the battlefield. The tone, the rhythm, the eyes that said it. There was only one person in the world who ever said it like that. Max's ears twitched. His body quivered. Like a gentle current flowing through veins long gone cold, he began to lift his head. His eyes blurred. Not from dust, not from wind, but from emotion so overwhelming it defied sound or motion. His stiff, brittle tail gave a single flick. Small, but it meant everything. It was a silent reply, a surrender to truth, a recognition, a confirmation. It's you. You came back. With every ounce of strength left in his broken frame, Max shifted forward slowly, unsteadily, not to collapse into her arms but to reach for her, to touch the comrade he had never stopped loving. Lauren, unable to hold back, wrapped her arms around his frail body, pulled him close, buried her face into his darkened coat, and wept, uncontrollably, helplessly, as if all the guilt, all the years, all the torment of not arriving sooner were pouring out in those burning tears. Max made no sound, but his eyes, now gleaming, glowing like a flame flaring once more in darkness, said everything. The wait was over. The one he trusted most had returned. Even if the promise was never spoken, she had kept it. And though the world had turned its back on him, Lauren, his comrade, his friend, his family, had not. In her arms, Max was no longer a discarded shell. He was a warrior returned, a hero found again, a soul saved by one word, one voice, one look that never forgot him. Sitz. Held in her arms, surrounded by late tears and shallow breaths, Max didn't know when he drifted off. He only remembered that the last thing he saw before his eyes closed was Lauren's gaze. Whole, remorseful, unwavering. When Max opened them again, he was lying on a cold metal table. Harsh white light poured down from the ceiling, and the sharp scent of antiseptic filled his nose, unlocking a flood of memories. But this time, there were no angry voices, no tightening collars, no cold hands pinning him down without kindness. Only a gentle voice, strange, female, laced with worry, and soft hands that touched him like he was something fragile, something sacred. That was Dr. Olivia Bennett, a seasoned veterinarian with calm, knowing eyes, eyes that had witnessed too much suffering. She didn't ask questions. She simply glanced at Lauren and nodded, as if she already understood. The dog before her didn't just need healing of the body, but of the soul, a living testament to what war and humanity so often forget. As she gently parted the blood-matted, dirt-crusted fur, her brows furrowed. Max's body was a map of pain, layered in old and new wounds, a deep scar across his left side, torn by shrapnel, open sores on his elbows from standing too long on concrete, bite-like marks on his neck, not from another dog, but from the jagged grip of steel training collars used in abusive camps. Max didn't flinch, didn't growl, just lay still, eyes open, watching Lauren nearby, as if to say he understood. He knew this wasn't harmful anymore. He knew the pain now was for healing. No matter how deep the needle went, no matter how the scalpel scraped at old wounds, this was not punishment. It was redemption. Each time Olivia pressed on an inflamed patch, Max only twitched slightly. No sound, just a slow, deep breath, followed by stillness. The kind of stillness a veteran learns, the kind chosen not out of defeat, but out of quiet courage and pride. Lauren stayed at his side the entire time, hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her face was frozen, eyes wide with the unbearable weight of what Max had endured while she had been gone. She didn't say a word, but Olivia knew, everyone in the room knew, that silence can be heavier than any apology. Lauren had thought she had fought enough, suffered enough, but as she looked at Max, still breathing, trusting her, she realized the pain she carried was only a fraction of what he had borne, alone. After more than an hour of examination, Olivia quietly jotted down notes in Max's file. Her voice was low and hoarse when she spoke. He's severely malnourished. There are widespread infections across the skin and muscle tissue. Some old fractures in his hip and back leg were never treated properly. And here, she pointed to symmetrical, patterned welts around Max's hind legs. These aren't random injuries. The spacing is too exact. He was likely restrained in some kind of forced training rig, or worse, used for demo drills. Lauren nearly collapsed at those words. Max remained still, eyes closed, ears laid back, as if bracing himself against the return of memories he'd tried to bury. But what struck Olivia more than the injuries was the silence. It wasn't exhaustion. It was familiarity. The way Max lay there without complaint wasn't passive. It was learned. Pain had become part of his daily rhythm, like wind in the desert or the heartbeat in a soldier's chest. And yet, within that stillness, she saw something miraculous. A flicker, buried deep but burning. A fire that refused to go out. In Max's eyes lived a stubborn faith that this pain meant something. That reuniting with Lauren wasn't just a miracle. It was the beginning of something greater than suffering. And just as Olivia gently spread the final layer of antibiotic over the deepest sore on Max's side, he slowly turned his head towards Lauren. The movement was deliberate, measured, not a cry for help, not a complaint, but a message, delivered in the quiet, steady gaze of a survivor. I'm still here, I waited for you, and I never gave up. And in that gaze, one with no blame, no resentment, only the quiet presence of a soul that had walked through hell and still chose to believe in humanity, Lauren understood. She couldn't keep Max's story in silence. His pain needed to be seen, to be understood. Not just for him, but for every four-legged warrior still suffering quietly in the dark. That night, under the dim light of an old kitchen lamp, as Max lay curled in a clean blanket for the first time in years, his breathing finally steadying, Lauren opened her phone. Her hands trembled as she selected the photo she had taken outside the clinic. Max, frail and hollow, lying on a faded blanket, his eyes fixed on her as if trying to say something beyond words. The photo didn't need a dramatic caption. Lauren wrote only one simple, heart-wrenching line. He once fought for this country, and this is how he was treated. She posted it to her account, not expecting much. Maybe a few shares from veteran friends, a few quiet comments of sympathy. But within hours, the post spread like wildfire in a summer drought. It sparked a storm of rage, sorrow, and a collective cry for justice. People didn't just feel sorry. They were furious. They demanded answers. Who had abandoned Max? Who was responsible for every scar on his body? How could a dog once honored for bravery be discarded like a broken tool? Veterans, retired officers, and even civilians who'd never served began sharing Max's story with hashtags full of anger and truth. Justice for Max, Forgotten Hero, War Dog Deserves Better. Animal rights groups got involved. Journalists started writing, and soon, local news teams were knocking on Lauren's door, asking to interview her, to meet Max. Not as a discarded animal, but as a symbol of everything broken in how we treat those who've given us everything. When the first camera rolled, the host whispered that they'd only shoot for a few minutes. But as the lights hit Max, the entire crew fell silent. Because even in his frailty, even with clouded eyes and a body still healing, the way Max lay there, calm, steady, staring directly into the lens as if he knew he was speaking on behalf of thousands like him. It froze people in their tracks. He didn't bark, didn't move, he didn't need to. That gaze, quiet but unshakable, told a story no words could ever hold. And through it, Max made millions of people pause, stop scrolling, and feel something real, painful, and beautiful. Even those who had once looked away from animal welfare campaigns found themselves moved. Because Max wasn't just a forgotten dog, he was a living witness to abandonment. A soul failed by a system that used loyalty like ammunition and discarded the body when it was no longer of use. And in the middle of this rising tide of emotion, a name reappeared: Victor Shaw. No longer mentioned with respect, but as the target of public outrage. A former soldier who had served under him came forward, exposing the cruelty inside Shaw's private training empire. Photos, voice recordings, and first-hand testimonies all began surfacing, unmasking the darkness behind the polished curtain of reconditioning programs. And Max was no longer just a victim. He was undeniable proof. Lauren didn't feel proud of the sudden spotlight. She felt relieved, because finally, Max's eyes, the same eyes that had waited for her in hopeless silence for so many years, had been seen, heard, and understood. That night, as she turned off her phone and pulled the blanket gently over Max's frail frame, he kept his eyes on her, calm, deep as the sea, eyes that said thank you, not for rescuing him, but for telling the story he thought would die with him in the dark. At that moment, Lauren understood what had always been true. Max was never just a dog. He was a storyteller, a torchbearer, a living memory of everything humanity had tried to forget, but never should. As that light continued to spread, when Max's story moved beyond the walls of the clinic and the small glow of a phone screen to touch the hearts of millions, Lauren realized that healing doesn't always begin in the hearts of adults. Sometimes it comes from the simplest, purest places: a smile, a gaze untouched by war or cruelty, one that knows only love. One soft, late summer afternoon, as cicadas still sang in the trees, the wooden gate in front of the porch gave a gentle creak, and a small figure appeared. It was Emma Patterson, the 10-year-old girl from next door. Her golden hair was hastily tied with a red ribbon, her arms wrapped around an old comic book, and her eyes shimmered with sunlight. Emma brought no fear with her, no hesitation. She saw Max resting quietly on a cushion in the middle of the living room, still thin, still weak, but clean now, and wrapped in the peaceful warmth of the little wooden house. She didn't rush over. She didn't immediately reach out like so many children might. Instead, she sat down a short distance away, close enough to share space, far enough to give him dignity, and began to tell stories. In a clear, dustless voice, she spoke of the treehouse she built with her dad, of her calico cat Miso, who liked to nap on bookshelves, and of her dream to become a vet, to help the ones who can't speak but still feel pain. Max watched her quietly, tilting his head slightly as if truly listening. His ears, though still drooping, twitched now and then, and with each story Emma told, his body seemed to soften, just a little. Not with wagging tails or playful barks like other dogs, but in his way, the way of an old soul. He didn't need Emma to pet him or praise him. All he needed was that quiet, honest presence, a tiny warmth slipping into the coldest corners of a heart that had known only shadows and discipline for years. Emma knew nothing of Victor Shaw. She had no image of metal collars or concrete cages, or the chilling voice that once declared, "If it dies, it saves a better life." She didn't need to, because in not knowing, she wasn't afraid. To her, Max was simply a big friend who had been hurt. Someone who needed stories, needed listening, needed a small stuffed bear named Poppy placed beside him, the same way she did when Miso was sick. Lauren, watching silently from the kitchen, froze in place when she saw Max, for the first time, lean his head forward toward Emma, his nose gently brushing the tiny open palm hovering in invitation. And then, like a flower blooming after a winter too long, Max slowly stretched his body, and his thin tail gave a single, soft wag. Not strong, not quick, but enough to make Lauren's heart ache. Because it wasn't just a response, it was a sign that trust was returning. Emma giggled, not because anything grand had happened, but because the big dog she had been talking to had listened. And in a child's world, being listened to is a gift. In Max's world, Emma wasn't just a visitor on a summer afternoon. She was a turning point, quiet and small, but powerful. For the first time in years, after war, betrayal, cages, and chains, Max felt love again, not from a handler, not from a trainer, but from a heart that had never known how to hurt anything. And so, with cicadas humming in the fading light, sunlight slanting through the window, Max closed his eyes. Not asleep, but at peace. As if in the war-torn landscape of his inner world, a single sunbeam had finally broken through. Emma hadn't erased the pain, but she had done something just as rare. She had made it smile. And in that exact moment, when Max's fragile head gently rested in the tiny palm of Emma's hand, surrounded by sunlight and silence, it was as if a warm current passed through the room, reaching into every corner of every heart that had ever known pain. Lauren's, Max's, and even Emma's, who had no idea just how monumental her small gesture truly was. But the miracle didn't end there. When Emma drew her hand back, smiling as she reached into her pocket for the peppermint candy she saved for special days, Max didn't lie back down as he usually did. He stayed upright, his legs trembling but steady, as if in that brief instant, some new current of memory had replaced his old instinct to retreat. It was as if, for the first time, he no longer wanted to stay in the place where wounded things lay still. He wanted to move. He wanted to try. He wanted to live again, in the truest sense. Lauren, just a few steps away, saw it all. From the shift in Max's eyes, to the way he leaned forward ever so slightly, then hesitated, then tried again. It was like watching a quiet war play out inside him, between the fear that had rooted itself so deeply and the faint but rising will to heal. Max was no longer the dog who once lay motionless in the shadow of a rusted shipping container, eyes closed to the smell of rot and rat droppings, waiting for death. Now he stood in the sunlight, surrounded by love, facing a short path from the living room to the porch. Just a few meters. But for Max, it was the length of a lifetime he had almost lost. His first steps were shaky. Dry paws tapped against the wooden floor, sliding slightly, sending his body swaying like it might collapse at any moment. But what held Lauren's gaze wasn't the fragility. It was Max's eyes. Though still dulled by time and damage, they now gleamed with something entirely new. Resolve, not defiance, not fear, but the unmistakable light of a being remembering he was never meant to stay broken. Sensing something special, Emma stopped talking. She folded her little hands in front of her chest, holding her breath. Max took another step, then another. Slow, so slow. Every time his foot touched the ground, his muscles clenched against weakness. Every breath came hard, like a whisper saying, "I'm still here." And when he reached the end of that small stretch, standing on the threshold where golden light poured in through the open door, back straight beneath the warm glow like a halo, Lauren could no longer hold herself together. She stepped forward, dropped to her knees and buried her face in Max's clean fur. her arms, shaking, wrapped around the neck that had once been crushed by heavy chains. Through her sobs, she whispered, "You did it. You came back, Max." And far away, behind another screen, the world held its breath. The video, captured hours later by a close friend who had quietly recorded the moment on their phone, went online with no warning. The first few seconds were silent. No music, no narration. Just a dog, once beaten, starved, and forgotten, taking slow, steady steps across a modest room, walking toward the light. His eyes, those same eyes that had once reflected gunfire and betrayal, that had seen comrades chained to death, that had stared into the cold face of Victor Shaw, now looked straight into the lens. No fear, no hate, just the quiet, unwavering look of a soul that had been shattered and was now standing up again. Max didn't need dramatic music. He didn't need clickbait headlines to become a symbol. His very being, his return, silent and steady and deeply human, was already the most powerful declaration of loyalty, survival, and hope. Among the thousands of comments that poured in, one short line made Lauren weep when she read it. He didn't walk for applause. He walked because someone was still waiting at the end of the road. The next morning, before sunlight could break through the thick clouds left behind by the night's storm, a forgotten stretch of land behind the old training compound drew quiet attention. Once a blind spot on the map, a scrubby forest left to rot after Victor Shaw's facility was silently shut down. It had long been ignored. Few knew it existed, and fewer still imagined that life remained there, clinging between collapsed fences, rusted shipping containers, twisted metal cages, and the haunting remnants of a system built on violence and neglect. But Max knew. He didn't need orders, maps, or confirmation. All it took was a faint whimper, the scent of fear laced with mud and dried blood, and he knew someone needed saving. As Max trudged through the mire, each paw sinking into the sodden earth, he didn't hesitate. His eyes no longer held the wild fear of a wounded creature, but the focused determination of a rescuer. The storm had collapsed part of an abandoned storage building, once used to house training gear, and beneath a sheet of torn roofing, a crooked iron crate had fallen across a small dog. It lay trembling, skeletal, its ash-gray fur matted and thin, a leg caught between two bent bars. No one knew where it came from. Perhaps a defective unit left behind, or a pup born inside captivity. But Max didn't need backstory. His instincts told him all he needed to know. Max didn't wait for Lauren's command, didn't glance back for support. He moved. Slipping through rubble and overgrowth, careful not to make a sound, he lowered his body and approached the trapped dog with astonishing gentleness, as though any noise might shatter it completely. The little dog, panicked and wheezing, first flinched at Max's approach, but then something shifted. As if comforted by an unspoken energy, it stilled, its frightened eyes clinging to Max's. And in that moment, the two were bound, not by blood, not by fate, but by something deeper, the quiet tether between beings hurt by the same unseen hand of greed and cruelty. Lauren stood several meters back, not daring to interfere. She knew Max was doing what he was born to do, not because someone told him to, but because it was written in his heart. He nudged aside debris with his muzzle, shifted his shoulder under the weight of a rusted beam, straining to lift it, each effort sending a sharp pain through the old wound in his side, the one left by shrapnel years ago in Kandahar when he saved Lauren's life. But Max didn't stop. He bore the pain in silence, never once looking away, never once slowing down. His focus was absolute. Clear a path, no matter the cost. After nearly 15 minutes of tense, rain-soaked effort, Max did it. The small dog wriggled free from the gap, limping but no longer trapped. Without hesitation, Max stepped in front, placing himself as a shield, guiding the pup through the wreckage with steady, protective steps. They returned home together, mud-streaked, exhausted, and covered in debris. Lauren and Emma stood frozen at the doorway. When they arrived, Lauren dropped to her knees, gently wiping the grime from Max's face with a soft towel. Her eyes were filled with pride and tears, because she understood. Max was no longer a soldier on paper, but he had never lost his mission. By the following day, news of the rescue had spread. A team of volunteers from an animal welfare organization arrived at the site, uncovering 3 more dogs, one severely ill, all emaciated. Moldering records found inside a rusted container revealed dozens of dogs, temporarily held for rehabilitation before transfer. But it was all a cover, a rotting system of exploitation. Once again, the name Victor Shaw surfaced, on supply orders, in shipping manifests tied to shell companies, and in a sworn statement from a former staffer who finally came forward after years of silence. The media now called Max the survivor hero, the last warrior, and the beating heart of the forgotten. But Max didn't care for names. Each morning he simply lay by the window, eyes calm as he watched the small gray dog, now named Dusty, racing across the backyard, stronger and livelier with each passing day. Whenever Dusty looked back toward Max, he answered with a soft gaze, sometimes a slow flick of his ear. Quiet, unassuming, but heavy with meaning. "You're alive. That's enough." Because some scars don't need to be healed. They only need to be seen. And some warriors don't need applause. They just need the chance to do what they were made to do. Max never needed a medal to know the heart of a hero inside him had never stopped beating, never rusted, never once refused to rise when another life called for help in a world still bleeding. As Max quietly watched Dusty play beneath the morning sun in the small garden, where life had begun to bloom again from the wreckage of forgotten years, he had no idea that, just beyond the weathered wooden fence, another soul was fighting a different kind of battle. A silent one. A man named Charlie Redford, a war veteran who had just moved into the small house next door after nearly a year of treatment for PTSD. A man trained never to flinch under gunfire and blood, yet who could not withstand the sound of fireworks on Independence Day. A man whose eyes had long since lost their light, now dimmed to the gray hue of fractured memories. Charlie lived quietly, rarely left the house. Whenever trucks rumbled past or children's voices rang out in the street, he would shut the door, pull the curtains tight, and sit motionless in the dark, clutching his old army-issued lighter like it was the last piece of himself he hadn't lost. People in the town knew of him, but no one ever got close. Not because he was angry, but because his silence was heavy. Too heavy for most to carry. But Max felt it. With no training, no commands, no cue, just a heart that had once been shattered and rebuilt, Max sensed the emptiness beyond the fence, and he began to approach. At first, Max simply stood by the gate each morning, never barking, never wagging, just looking toward the gray house where Charlie sat alone behind the window. Over time, the distance closed. Every day when Lauren walked him, Max would sit patiently by the fence, waiting. Not pushing, not demanding, just present, just as he once lay beside Lauren's hospital bed for hours at a time at the military base years ago. And then, on a misty morning, Charlie opened the window for the first time since he moved in. And when he saw Max, those steady eyes, free from pity or judgment, something in him shifted, gently, like wind brushing across the surface of a frozen lake. Max didn't charge forward, didn't bark, or leap with excitement. He simply stood up, took a few steps, and sat down. His calm eyes looked up at Charlie, an expression he had once given wounded comrades on the battlefield. It was the kind of look that made you feel seen, feel less alone, feel like you still mattered. The next day, Max came again. And the day after that, every day, Charlie stepped a little farther out the door. His hands still trembled. His eyes still darted away. But then one afternoon, he sat down on the porch steps, opened a water bottle, and for the first time in months of silence, he spoke. "Hey there, soldier." Max, as if he understood, walked over slowly. He didn't touch Charlie, just sat beside him, his back gently leaning against the veteran's leg, as if offering warmth without pressing against the wounds. From that moment, something unspoken began to grow. Charlie started leaving the house more often. He visited Lauren's garden for the first time, accepted a homemade cookie from Emma without turning away, and one day finally shared his story. He told of losing his team in an ambush, of the military dog that howled in agony after stepping on a mine, and how the sound of panting dogs had haunted his sleepless nights ever since. But Max was different. He never made noise, never approached without permission. Max wasn't just a dog. He was a witness, someone who understood, a fellow warrior who could sense the pain buried beneath skin that looked whole. Max was the first Charlie let rest his head on his lap without flinching, the first soul he trusted enough to leave beside him in the dark when panic came, the first being who didn't need to hear the story to know that under that worn military jacket beat a heart still bleeding. Lauren saw it all, and she knew, just as she had known from the start, that Max's eyes never misjudged, that this time Max didn't save anyone with heroic acts. He saved with his presence, with silence, like a soldier standing night watch so his comrade could finally sleep. In a world full of noise, sometimes healing doesn't come in words, but in a quiet lean, a look free of judgment, and a heart that's been shattered but still beats for other lost souls. And Max, no longer in uniform, without a tag or a leash, was still fulfilling his mission, not on the battlefield, but in the quietest corners of life, where people just need one reason to keep going. It was the quiet bond between Max and Charlie, one scarred on the outside, the other broken within, that made Lauren believe Max wasn't just healing. He was quietly spreading that healing into the world, steady and invisible like an underground current, slow but powerful. But then, on a golden autumn afternoon, just as life seemed to be settling into a rare rhythm of peace, fate struck again, as if to test whether the warrior still stirred in Max's heart. It was a calm Saturday. Lauren took Max along on a quick trip to the town's convenience store, where she usually grabbed a coffee, a bag of fresh beans for dinner, and small treats for Emma. Max, now nearly fully recovered, sat calmly in the passenger seat, leash loosely fastened, ears perked, eyes alert, yet his body relaxed in that strange way only a dog trained for war can be, knowing exactly where the line lies between calm and chaos. When Lauren parked beneath the big tree out front, she patted his head and said what she always did. "Just a few minutes, okay?" Max tilted his head slightly, tail swaying like a quiet nod. But less than 3 minutes after Lauren disappeared behind the sliding glass doors, the peace shattered. A figure burst into the store, hood pulled up, a black pistol trembling in his hand, his voice cracking with panic as he shouted for everyone to hit the floor. Max didn't need to hear the words. He didn't need to see the gun. The shift in the air, the tension in the voices, the fear leaking through glass. He felt it all, instantly. He raised his head, sniffed sharply. His ears flicked like radar, and then came a child's scream, sharp, terrified. That sound pierced through Max's mind like a blade, slicing open a vault of memories from distant war zones, of urgent missions and danger he'd faced 100 times before. Instinct kicked in. Max bit through the leash clasp, a maneuver he'd been trained for in the military. The car door wasn't fully locked, and with one push of his nose, it sprang open. He slipped out without a sound, a blur of gray and gold fur moving low and fast through the parking lot, weaving between trees and cars like a streak of wind. Inside, the young robber, barely more than a boy, was clutching a girl, maybe 7 years old, pulling her toward the counter with the barrel of the gun pressed to her temple. His hands shook. His eyes screamed desperation. Everyone else lay face down, frozen. The only man who tried to intervene had already been knocked to the floor. Then, in that moment when time seemed to stop, A tiny sound echoed from the far corner, barely a whisper, just enough to make the girl look up. Her teary eyes locked onto a form moving silently across the floor, low, tight to the tiles, not a breath out of place. The eyes that met hers weren't panicked or wild. They were clear, focused, burning. The eyes of a soldier waiting for the signal to strike. The gun wavered, just a fraction to the left. Max launched. No bark, no growl, just a blur of muscle and motion. His jaws closed around the gun hand, yanking it backward with the precision of years of training. The pistol flew from the boy's grasp, clattering to the floor. The girl screamed and collapsed, quickly pulled to safety behind a shelf by a nearby woman. Max didn't bite to maim. He didn't tear or rage. He held the wrist, firm and controlled, until the boy collapsed. Then, Max positioned himself between the weapon and the threat, fur bristling, back arched, eyes locked on the assailant. No fear, no fury, just cold, clear resolve, the kind that comes from knowing exactly what life is worth. Police burst in less than 2 minutes later, but it was already over. Max backed off only when Lauren called him. He was panting, jaws slightly open, but his gaze never left the robber's pale, trembling face. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," the boy kept mumbling. "I just needed money, needed to get away from that place." And that one sentence was enough. Lauren knew immediately what he meant. That place was the illegal training camp once run by Victor Shaw, a place that fed both humans and dogs violence instead of care. The media called it a daring rescue. Security footage aired across every news channel, showing Max's lightning-fast strike, a blur of courage in a moment of chaos. He was hailed as a hero, his image becoming a symbol of bravery and justice. But to Lauren, to Emma, who wrapped her arms around Max when he came home, and to the little girl whose life he saved, Max was more than a hero. He was living proof that something good still survived in the world. A quiet courage that didn't need applause, a spirit that didn't wait for orders or rewards, just a heart that refused to stay still when someone was in danger. That night, when the security footage aired on national television, capturing the moment Max surged from the shadows like a living arrow, taking down the armed robber with one precise, controlled bite, the entire country seemed to pause. Not because the scene looked like something out of an action movie, but because of the absolute calm in Max's eyes. Even in the face of danger, he held a stillness that couldn't be faked. A stillness born only from the brutal years of a warrior who had truly fought for others. Media outlets flooded in. Local news, national TV stations, military magazines, animal welfare groups, all wanted to know about this dog named Max. Not just because of his heroic act, but because the story behind his lean frame held a quiet tragedy. The fate of dogs who had served their country, only to be forgotten when the battle ended. Max didn't care for the flashing cameras, the microphones pushed close, or the crowds that gathered around with lenses raised. He had stood in far worse, battlefields soaked in blood, under skies split by explosions. He had faced danger not for fame, but because it was the right thing to do. And now, sitting with Lauren on the back porch as autumn leaves scattered around them, Max watched the world with the calm gaze of someone who had walked through hell and still chose to believe in something good. Reporters waited, hoping to catch something touching. A tail wag, a tilt of the head, a gentle lean into his human's shoulder. And what they got was greater. A deep, steady gaze that seemed to look straight into the part of humanity so many had forgotten still existed. One respected paper called Max the Warrior Without Armor. A major TV network named him the Silent National Hero. Articles, podcasts, and inspirational features poured in, placing Max alongside the bravest of heroes, not as a loyal pet, but as a living symbol of loyalty, of quiet strength, and of a love for humans that asked for nothing in return. His story sparked questions, hard ones. People began to look again at the system that had abandoned dogs like him. The name Victor Shaw resurfaced, now spoken with open outrage. A former employee from Shaw's illegal training operation came forward, admitting he had seen Max among many other dogs forced into behavioral reprogramming, a place where the wounds didn't come from war, but from the hands of those who once wore the uniform. In the middle of the media storm, Max remained unchanged. He wasn't proud. He wasn't nervous. He simply continued his life. Mornings sitting with Lauren, watching the mist roll in. Afternoons walking through town with Emma and Dusty. Nights resting quietly at Charlie's feet. Charlie still sometimes woke to echoes of gunfire in his dreams, but with Max beside him, those dreams had begun to soften. Nothing about Max's routine changed because to him, national hero was never a goal. It was just an unexpected byproduct of a heart that had never stopped choosing others. And then, one early morning, Max sat silently beside Lauren, staring at the newspaper in her hands, the one with his photo mid-leap, moments before saving the girl. His eyes were calm, as always, but in them there was a faint shimmer. Not pride, not emotion, but a deep, quiet peace. The kind that comes from understanding what it means to be given a second chance at life, and using that life to offer hope to those who thought theirs was already lost. Max didn't speak, but his eyes, fixed once more on the camera lens, just as they had been in that first broadcast, spoke for every silent warrior who'd ever lived. Loyalty doesn't need a medal. It just needs to be seen. That calm gaze, seen by millions through television screens, carried more than loyalty. It held something unspoken, like Max was trying to share a missing piece of a larger truth, a truth still hiding behind the spotlight of recognition. Lauren didn't realize it through headlines or broadcasts, but in the way Max changed every time they passed the small forest to the north of town. His eyes would suddenly sharpen, his steps slow and heavy, his nose pulling deep breaths from the air as if searching for something unseen. And each time, he would look at her, an urgent, silent plea in his eyes that she could no longer ignore. Trusting Max's instincts, Lauren reached out to Sheriff Miller, the aging police chief, a fellow veteran, and one of Max's earliest defenders after the convenience store incident. When she shared her hunch, Miller didn't hesitate. By the next morning, a small team had formed. Him, Lauren, Charlie, now fully steady and sharp, and Max. They didn't bring a map. No directions, just the instincts of a survivor who had lived through the worst of what humans could do to the innocent. Max didn't rush. He moved with purpose, guiding them through a trail buried beneath years of fallen leaves, then off-path to a part of the forest no one had touched in decades. At every turn, he paused, sniffed, and scanned the woods with the precision of a trained scout tracking the enemy. And then, after nearly an hour, they arrived at a rusted metal fence nearly consumed by time. Behind it, hidden beneath overgrown pine, was a low concrete structure. Something Lauren recognized. An old auxiliary warehouse once rumored to be out of use, located just beyond the official perimeter of the former training facility. Max froze. No growl, no bark. His back arched slightly, ears pointed, eyes tense like a bowstring drawn tight. Then, as if to confirm what he already knew, he stepped forward and scratched a long mark across the steel door. Sheriff Miller raised a hand. When the door was finally pried open, a wave of stench poured out. Disinfectant, filth, and rot so thick it made them all stagger back. Inside, under the flicker of weak fluorescent light, rows of metal cages stretched deep into the shadows. In each cage was a dog, skeletal, eyes dull and exhausted. Some wore electronic collars. Others were chained directly to steel bars. No bedding, no clean water, no kind human voice for weeks. Max entered first. He moved silently between cages, pressing his nose to the bars, checking for signs of life. With each step, his eyes glinted with something between recognition and rage. Recognition, because he had once been inside a cage like this. rage because some of them still were. One trembling Malinois backed away as Max approached, but when their eyes met, they both froze. Then, the other dog gave a small wag of the tail, weak but unmistakable. A gesture that seemed to say, "You came back, you survived, so maybe I can too." Charlie stepped forward, hand gripping his holstered sidearm, eyes red with fury and grief. Sheriff Miller turned away, pulled out his phone, and called the Federal Investigation Division, voice low but firm. "We've found hell." The site was immediately sealed and escalated to higher authorities. Victor Shaw, who had claimed all his operations were shut down, was summoned for questioning the very next day. On camera, he simply shrugged and smirked. "I don't know anything about that place." But no one believed him, because Max's eyes, shown in close-up on the evening news, delivered a statement louder than words. That memory doesn't fade. Those who abandoned their humanity will one day face the ones they left behind in the dark. And in the heavy silence that hung over the warehouse, Max lifted his head. His gaze passed through the steel bars, not with anger, not with drama, but with a quiet resolve, like a promise spoken without sound. A promise that as long as even one soul remained caged, forgotten, or treated like a tool, he, the warrior once discarded, would be the one to lead them out. Not for revenge, but for justice. Not for himself, but for every heart that had ever been broken and still refused to stop beating. And as if that silent promise had just been spoken by Max himself, through an unyielding gaze behind rusted iron bars, only a day later, a new mission once again led him into danger. This time, it wasn't a battlefield in the Middle East, nor a rescue in the heart of a city. It was something far darker, the last hidden corner of the secret training camps once run by Victor Shaw. Though files had been burned and gates padlocked, the muffled whimpers, the stench of filth, and the haunting eyes of forgotten lives still whispered of a hell that had never truly ended. When an anonymous tip reached Sheriff Miller, revealing the coordinates of a satellite site deep in the national forest over 30 miles from town, uncatalogued, unsigned, and unrecorded, he knew there was only one way to enter without raising suspicion. Follow Max. It was the same small team, Max in front, followed by Lauren, Charlie, and Sheriff Miller. They carried only the essentials for reconnaissance, but their mindset was that of soldiers stepping into hostile territory, for no one knew what awaited them. From the moment Max set foot on the narrow trail into the woods, he became a warrior once more. His body low, his steps silent, ears pricked forward, and nose constantly scanning the wind for invisible signals only those once hunted would recognize. The path led them through towering trees and dense underbrush, where even the crackle of a dry leaf could give them away. Yet Max moved flawlessly, every motion a silent symphony of instinct and vigilance. When they neared the marked location, Max froze, lowering himself into the brush, his eyes locked on a barbed wire fence nearly 2 meters high. Behind it stood decaying tin-roofed buildings, still showing signs of life. Dim light in one room, a faint hum of a generator, and the acrid scent of rotting meat carried on the wind. Without waiting for a command, Max slid through a gap beneath the fence where rain had softened the earth. He led the way inside, each step guiding the others through the darkness. Every move revolved around Max. During the entire infiltration, he was their scout, their sentinel, the soul holding them steady through the tension-choked silence. It was Max who spotted the security camera hidden in the tree roots. By stopping, staring directly at it, and giving a low growl, signaling the team to alter their course. It was Max who picked up the scent of a guard asleep inside, a young man reeking of cheap liquor and careless duty, giving them just enough time to slip past while he remained lost in his stupor. And it was Max who approached the kennel area first, where dozens of nameless dogs were locked in cages, identified only by chain color and crude markings on rusted metal. A one-eyed dog immediately stood and growled, tense with fear. but Max simply pressed his nose to the bars and let out a low, familiar breath, a silent language of warriors who had once fought side by side. The dog froze, sat down, and tilted its head as if it recognized a comrade who had returned from the dead. Lauren and Sheriff Miller worked fast, unlocking cages with tools they'd brought, while Charlie checked each dog to make sure they could walk. Some were too weak to stand, and in those cases, Max didn't move on. He stayed, lying beside them, lending his body as a brace, just as he once did for Lauren during the nights she lay wounded on the front lines. He left no one behind, and every time a dog stepped out of that rusted gate, Max's eyes flickered with a quiet flame, not blazing, but steady, as if his heartbeat whispered a promise never to abandon the mission. When they safely withdrew with all 13 rescued dogs, including 3 who once carried now deactivated military chips, Sheriff Miller said nothing. He simply placed a hand on Lauren's shoulder, his eyes misty as he watched Max lead the silent procession through the trees, ears alert, still refusing to rest. And at the edge of town, with dawn breaking along the boundary between night and day, Max turned back, gazing at the forest behind, the place that had once been hell, now uncovered, like he knew he'd